Thunder rumbled across the sky as rain poured down on the abandoned racehorse farm. Nestled in the corner of a dilapidated stable, a once magnificent chestnut stallion named Valor trembled, his chocolate-brown eyes wide with terror. His sleek coat, once gleaming with health, was now matted and dull. A deep scar ran along his right flank, a permanent reminder of the crash that had ended his racing career and cost him his trust in humans. 3 months ago, Valor had been the pride of Westfield stables, expected to win the prestigious Golden Cup. His owner, the calculating business tycoon Richard Pornton, had invested millions in the horse's training. But when Valor's trailer overturned on the way to the race, the horse survived with a badly damaged leg. The veterinarians had done their best, but the prognosis was clear. Valor would never race again. Richard had abandoned him to this ramshackle farm with minimal care, a cruel fate for an animal once worth millions, now deemed worthless. The stable hands, frustrated by Valor's fear-driven aggression, eventually stopped trying to approach him. He had become known as the Mad Horse, left alone in his stall, fed only by pushing hay through the gaps in the wooden slats. Miles away, Thomas Bennett wiped sweat from his brow as he inspected his modest farmland. At 45, his weathered face told the story of a man who had faced numerous hardships but never surrendered to them. The drought had been merciless this year, and Thomas knew his small farm was on the verge of bankruptcy. The bank had given him 1 month to make the payment, or he would lose the land that had been in his family for generations. That evening, as Thomas sat at his worn kitchen table reviewing his finances, the telephone rang. It was his old friend Dr. Peterson, the local veterinarian. "Thomas, I've got a situation," Peterson explained. "There's a horse at the old Westfield place, a thoroughbred that nobody can handle. They're planning to put him down tomorrow. I know you'd have a way with troubled animals." Thomas sighed deeply. "Pete, I'm barely keeping myself afloat here." "The thing is," Peterson continued, "this horse was once worth a fortune. If anyone could rehabilitate him." Thomas stared out the window at his failing crops. He had always had a special connection with animals, especially the broken ones. Years of patience and gentle care had earned him a reputation as a horse whisperer, of sorts, though he never claimed such a title. "I'll come see it in the morning," Thomas finally agreed, knowing he couldn't bear the thought of an animal being destroyed simply because humans had failed it. As dawn broke over the horizon, Thomas drove his beat-up truck to the abandoned stables. The farm manager, a gruff man named Howard, led him to Valor's stall. "Don't get too close," Howard warned. "That beast would sooner kick your head in than look at you." Thomas stood quietly outside the stall, observing the magnificent horse cowering in the corner. Even in his neglected state, Valor's noble bloodline was evident. Their eyes met, the scared animal and the desperate farmer, both at the end of their ropes, both with everything to lose. "I'll take him," Thomas said softly, surprising even himself. Howard looked at Thomas as though he'd lost his mind. "Your funeral. Just sign these papers releasing us from liability." That afternoon, with extreme difficulty and patience, Thomas managed to coax Valor into a borrowed trailer. As they drove away from the place of Valor's torment, neither man nor horse could have possibly imagined how their broken paths would soon intertwine with the life of one of the wealthiest women in the county, or how their shared journey would change all their fates forever. The first week with Valor tested every ounce of Thomas's patience. The horse refused to leave the small enclosure Thomas had prepared, ears pinned back and teeth bared whenever anyone approached. Food was left untouched until Thomas disappeared from sight. At night, Thomas would sit on a hay bale outside the stable, speaking in low, soothing tones, reading aloud from old farming almanacs, not because he thought Valor understood the words, but because he hoped the horse would grow accustomed to his voice. By the 8th day, exhaustion and financial worry had etched deeper lines into Thomas's face. The bank's deadline loomed ever closer, and he'd spent precious resources on a horse that might never trust him. That morning, when he entered the stable with fresh hay and water, something unexpected happened. Rather than retreating to the corner, Valor remained still, watching Thomas with wary but curious eyes. "Well, that's something, isn't it?" Thomas murmured, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You're figuring out I'm not here to hurt you." Slowly, over the next few days, a tentative routine developed. Thomas would sit in the enclosure, a bit farther from Valor each day, while the horse gradually ventured closer. By the end of the second week, Valor was cautiously accepting apple slices from Thomas's outstretched palm, a breakthrough that brought tears to the farmer's weathered eyes. Meanwhile, across town in an expansive estate surrounded by manicured gardens, Eleanor Pierce reviewed acquisition proposals in her home office. At 52, Eleanor had built one of the most successful investment firms in the state, accumulating substantial wealth in the process. Yet behind her polished exterior and shrewd business acumen lay a profound loneliness she rarely acknowledged. Eleanor's passion had always been horses. Growing up in modest circumstances, she had fallen in love with riding during a school field trip to a local stable. Through scholarships and later her own hard-earned money, she had become an accomplished equestrian. But a devastating fall 10 years ago had left her with a fear she couldn't overcome. Her private stable now housed beautiful horses she admired from a distance but no longer rode. That afternoon, Eleanor's oldest friend and personal assistant, Margaret, entered her office with excitement. "You need to see this, Ellie," she insisted, using a nickname from their school days. She placed her tablet in front of Eleanor, displaying a local social media post. Thomas Bennett standing beside Valor, the horse gently taking food from his hand. The caption read, "Day 15. He finally trusts me enough to eat. Maybe there's hope for us both." Eleanor studied the image, instantly recognizing the exceptional conformation of the horse despite his poor condition. Who is this man, and how did he end up with what appears to be a thoroughbred worth a small fortune? "He's a local farmer," Margaret explained. "Apparently the horse was injured, deemed worthless for racing. Word is, Thomas took him in when the previous owner was going to have him destroyed." Something about the story, and the gentle determination in the farmer's eyes, resonated with Eleanor. "Find out more about him," she instructed Margaret, "and schedule a visit to his farm for tomorrow." The next morning, Thomas was brushing Valor, speaking softly to him about the bank notice that had arrived yesterday. Final warning before foreclosure, when the sound of tires on gravel announced visitors. The sleek black luxury SUV that pulled up was starkly out of place on his modest property. Eleanor Pierce emerged, dressed in casual but obviously expensive riding clothes. Thomas recognized her immediately from newspaper business sections, though he had no idea why someone of her stature would be visiting his failing farm. "Mr. Bennett," she called, approaching with confident strides, "I'm Eleanor Pierce. I believe you've acquired a rather special horse." Thomas stepped protectively in front of Valor, who had already begun to retreat in fear at the stranger's approach. "He's not for sale, if that's why you're here." Eleanor paused, studying both man and horse with keen interest. "Actually, Mr. Bennett, I'm here to make you a proposition that might benefit all three of us." Eleanor Pierce maintained a respectful distance from the nervous horse, her experienced eyes noting every detail of Valor's condition, the healing scar, the tense muscles, but also the newfound alertness in his gaze. More intriguing still was the protective stance of the farmer, a man who clearly had little to his name yet stood prepared to refuse what would undoubtedly be a generous offer. "May I ask how you came to own this horse?" Eleanor inquired, her voice deliberately soft. Thomas briefly explained Valor's racing accident and subsequent abandonment. "The vet called me because they were going to put him down. Nobody wanted to deal with him anymore." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And you took him, despite your own difficulties." It wasn't a question. The state of the farm spoke volumes about Thomas's financial situation. "Some things matter more than money, Miss Pierce," Thomas replied simply. A smile touched Eleanor's lips. "On that, we might agree more than you think." She gestured toward a weathered bench near the fence. "Perhaps we could talk? I promise I haven't come to take your horse." Reluctantly, Thomas secured Valor's enclosure and joined Eleanor. For the first time, he noticed the slight stiffness in her movement, the careful way she lowered herself to the bench. Eleanor didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I own Willowbrook Estates," she said, referring to the sprawling 300-acre property on the other side of the county, known for its state-of-the-art equestrian facilities. "Why don't I have someone who can work with troubled horses the way you evidently can?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a partnership," Eleanor clarified. "You've accomplished more with this horse in 2 weeks than most trainers could in months. I have the resources to provide the best rehabilitation for him, veterinary care, nutrition, specialized equipment, and you have the gift to help him trust again." Thomas looked back toward Valor, conflicted. "He's just starting to feel safe here." "I'm not suggesting separating you," Eleanor continued. "My proposal includes accommodations for you at Willowbrook. You would work primarily with this horse, but eventually with others who need your approach. The compensation would be considerable." Thomas's pride warred with practicality. The bank's deadline was less than 2 weeks away, and Eleanor's offer could be the miracle he needed. Yet something felt unresolved. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why invest in a broken-down horse and a failing farmer?" Eleanor's composed facade slipped momentarily, revealing a vulnerability that surprised Thomas. "Because I understand what it means to lose trust," she said quietly, "and I recognize the value in someone who knows how to rebuild it." Before Thomas could respond, a distant rumble of thunder caused Valor to whinny in distress. Thomas immediately stood, excusing himself to calm the agitated horse. Eleanor watched as he approached the enclosure, speaking in that same gentle cadence she'd observed when arriving. Within minutes, Valor's panic subsided under Thomas's patient attention. That evening, after Eleanor had departed with a business card and instructions to consider the offer carefully, Thomas sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, turning the card over in his hands. Willowbrook Estates represented security, not just for him, but for Valor. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's interest went beyond business. There had been something personal in her eyes when she watched him with Valor. 3 days later, Thomas stood at the impressive gates of Willowbrook Estates, Valor safely transported in a luxury horse trailer Eleanor had sent. The decision had been difficult but necessary. The farm would go into foreclosure, but Thomas had negotiated terms with Eleanor that would allow him to eventually buy it back if their arrangement proved successful. As they drove through the immaculate grounds toward the stables, Thomas marveled at the contrast between this world and his own. Prize-winning horses grazed in lush paddocks, attended by uniformed staff. It was everything Valor deserved, but nothing that Thomas was accustomed to. Eleanor greeted them at the specially prepared stable, a quiet corner facility, isolated from the busier training areas. "I thought you might do better with fewer distractions," she explained, leading them inside. The stall she prepared was spacious and comfortable without being overwhelming. Thomas nodded appreciatively at the thoughtful setup, noting that Eleanor had clearly considered Valor's traumatized state. As they worked together to settle Valor into his new surroundings, Thomas caught glimpses of a different Eleanor Pierce than the one portrayed in business magazines, a woman who knew horses intimately, who understood their needs and fears. When she thought he wasn't looking, he noticed her massaging her right hip, the movement suggesting an old injury. "You used to ride," Thomas observed as they walked back toward the main house after Valor had finally settled. Eleanor's step faltered slightly. "A lifetime ago," she replied, her tone making it clear the subject was closed. What neither of them realized, as they parted ways that evening, Thomas to the comfortable guest cottage and Eleanor to her empty mansion, was that Valor's journey from broken champion to healing spirit would become the bridge between two wounded souls who had forgotten how to trust not just others, but themselves. The first month at Willowbrook established a rhythm that centered around Valor's rehabilitation. Each morning, Thomas would arrive at the isolated stable before sunrise, speaking softly to the horse while cleaning his stall and preparing his specialized feed. By mid-morning, Eleanor would appear, impeccably dressed yet somehow slightly apart from the luxurious world she had created. She rarely entered Valor's space but watched attentively as Thomas worked with the horse, gradually introducing gentle exercises to strengthen his injured leg. The veterinarian Eleanor had hired, Dr. Michaels, was impressed with Valor's progress. "His physical recovery is remarkable," Dr. Michaels commented during a checkup in the 4th week. "But the psychological transformation is what's truly extraordinary. Most horses with his trauma history never fully recover their temperament." Thomas shrugged off the praise. "He's doing all the work. I'm just giving him the chance." Eleanor, observing from outside the stall, noted the modesty that seemed so natural to Thomas, so different from the credit-claiming executives she dealt with daily. She found herself lingering longer during these sessions, occasionally offering suggestions based on her extensive equestrian knowledge, which Thomas received without ego or defensiveness. One evening, after a particularly successful day when Valor had allowed Thomas to lead him in circles around the larger paddock, Eleanor invited Thomas to dinner at the main house. Her usual practice of dining alone with financial reports would not suffice. This milestone deserved acknowledgement. The grand dining room, with its crystal chandelier and antique furniture, made Thomas acutely aware of his worn jeans and calloused hands. Eleanor, sensing his discomfort, suggested they eat in the kitchen instead, a space that, while still luxurious by Thomas's standards, felt more welcoming. As they shared a meal prepared by Eleanor herself to Thomas's surprise, conversation flowed more easily than either had expected. They'd found common ground in their love of the land, though they'd experienced it from vastly different perspectives. "My father lost our first farm when I was 12, Thomas shared, the memory still sharp after all these years. He never recovered from it. When I finally managed to buy our current place 15 years ago, I promised myself I'd never let it go." Eleanor studied him over her wine glass. Yet you were willing to risk it for a horse nobody wanted. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Some debts can't be measured in dollars, Miss Pierce. Eleanor, she corrected softly. After a month of watching you gentle that mad horse, I think we can dispense with formalities. The conversation shifted when Thomas inadvertently mentioned riding techniques, causing Eleanor's expression to close. Recognizing the boundary, he changed the subject, but the question lingered in his mind. Later that week, while exercising Valor on a longer lead in the meadow behind the stables, Thomas was surprised to see Eleanor approaching on foot, dressed more casually than usual in jeans and a simple blouse. More surprising still was the halter she carried. I thought perhaps today Valor might accept a second human in his circle, she suggested, her tone light though Thomas could detect the underlying tension. Thomas nodded, understanding the significance of this request. For weeks, Eleanor had maintained her distance, appreciating Valor from afar. This step forward represented something important. Talk to me about how you approach him, Eleanor requested as they stood outside Valor's field of vision. Not just the techniques, what goes through your mind? Thomas considered the question seriously. I try to see the world as he sees it, he finally answered. Every movement has meaning. His fear isn't irrational, it's based on experience. My job isn't to overpower that fear, but to prove consistently that a different experience is possible. Eleanor absorbed his words, then asked quietly, and does that approach work with humans as well as forces? The question hung between them, laden with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Their careful dance continued over the following weeks. Eleanor began participating more actively in Valor's rehabilitation, always under Thomas's guidance. The horse gradually accepted her presence, though he remained most responsive to Thomas. Meanwhile, the staff at Willowbrook observed with interest the unusual amount of time their employer spent at the isolated stable, and how her typically rigid demeanor softened in the farmer's presence. What remained unspoken was the growing awareness between them, an understanding that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Eleanor recognized in Thomas a man whose integrity was not for sale, whose gentleness concealed an unbreakable strength. Thomas saw in Eleanor a complexity the world missed behind her wealth and power, a wounded spirit as much in need of healing as Valor's. Then came the stormy night that changed everything. A violent summer thunderstorm swept across the county, triggering Valor's deepest fears. The stable hand on night duty called Thomas in panic as the horse became uncontrollable, throwing himself against the stall walls in terror. Thomas raced from his cottage through the downpour, arriving to find Eleanor already there, drenched and attempting to calm the frantic animal. Without hesitation, Thomas entered the stall, placing himself at risk to prevent Valor from self-injury. Eleanor followed, ignoring Thomas's warning to stay back. For hours they worked together, their voices forming a harmonious calm in the chaos of the storm. When Valor finally settled, they sat exhausted on the straw-covered floor, the horse's massive head resting trustingly in Thomas's lap, while Eleanor gently stroked his neck. 10 years ago, Eleanor said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the diminishing rain, I was thrown during a championship jump. The horse, my beloved Artemis, broke his leg and had to be euthanized. My hip was shattered. The doctors said I'd never ride competitively again. Thomas waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. I couldn't bear to be near horses after that, yet couldn't imagine life without them. So I built this place, surrounded myself with their beauty, but never allowed myself to connect. Until now. Her eyes met Thomas's in the dim light. Until you showed me another way. As dawn broke through the stable windows, something fundamental had shifted between them. The walls they had built, she with her wealth, he with his pride, had begun to crumble, revealing the simple truth that healing rarely happens in isolation. Sometimes it takes a troubled horse and 2 broken people to make something whole again. September painted Willowbrook's rolling hills with early autumn colors as Valor's rehabilitation entered a crucial phase. Dr. Michaels had cleared him for more intensive training, suggesting it was time to determine whether he could accept a rider again. This milestone brought the question neither Thomas nor Eleanor had been eager to face. What was Valor's future to be? The morning of the first riding attempt dawned clear and cool. Thomas had spent extra time preparing Valor, using a saddle pad and lightweight saddle for short periods over the past week. The horse had accepted these with minimal resistance, a testament to how far he'd come from the terrified creature in that abandoned stable. Thomas led Valor to the smallest training ring, where Eleanor waited by the fence. Their relationship had evolved into a comfortable partnership over the past months, professional boundaries softening into friendship. Yet Thomas remained acutely aware of the fundamental differences in their positions. He was still an employee, however uniquely valued, and she the owner of this magnificent estate. "Are you certain about this?" Eleanor asked as Thomas made final adjustments to Valor's tack. "There's no rush." Thomas patted Valor's neck reassuringly. "He's ready to try. The question is, who should be the first up there?" They had discussed this extensively. Thomas was the obvious choice given Valor's trust in him, but his large frame wasn't ideal for the horse's first experience with weight after his injury. The professional riders on staff had been suggested and dismissed. Strangers would only trigger Valor's anxiety. Eleanor had remained conspicuously silent during these discussions. Now, as they stood in the morning light, she stepped forward. "It should be me." Thomas looked at her sharply. "Eleanor, you haven't ridden in 10 years. Which makes me the least threatening option," she reasoned, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm lighter than you, experienced enough to remain balanced, and Valor has accepted my presence. Most importantly, I won't overcorrect if he resists." What she didn't articulate was the calling she felt, that this moment was somehow meant for both her and Valor, two beings whose confidence had been shattered by circumstance. Thomas studied her face, recognizing the resolution behind her calm exterior. "You're afraid," he observed quietly, not as criticism but acknowledgement. Terrified, she admitted with a small smile. But sometimes fear needs to be faced alongside someone you trust. The word hung between them, significant in its simplicity. After ensuring Eleanor was equipped with a safety vest and helmet, Thomas brought Valor to the mounting block. The horse tensed slightly but remained still as Thomas murmured constant reassurance. With practiced movements that belied her decade-long absence from the saddle, Eleanor swung herself up, settling gently on Valor's back. For a breathless moment, everyone froze, woman, horse, and observer locked in anticipation. Then Valor shifted, adjusting to the weight, but didn't panic. Thomas kept hold of the lead rope, walking beside them as Eleanor asked for the smallest movements, a few steps forward, a pause, a few more steps. "You're doing beautifully, both of you," Thomas encouraged, unable to hide the pride in his voice. Eleanor's face transformed as they completed their first slow circuit of the ring. The corporate executive disappeared, replaced by the passionate equestrian she had once been. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her posture remained perfectly balanced, her hands gentle on the reins. After 15 minutes, Thomas suggested they end on this success. Eleanor dismounted carefully, her legs unsteady not from physical weakness, but emotional overwhelm. "He trusted me," she whispered, stroking Valor's forelock. "After everything he's been through, he trusted me." "He's not the only one who took a leap of faith today," Thomas replied, his hand briefly covering hers on the reins. That evening, Eleanor invited Thomas to her private study, a warm, book-lined room he hadn't seen before. Unlike the formal spaces where they usually met, this room reflected Eleanor's personal tastes: equestrian art on the walls, well-worn classics on the shelves, comfortable leather furniture arranged for conversation rather than impression. As they shared a bottle of wine, Eleanor revealed her emerging vision, transforming part of Willowbrook into a rehabilitation center for injured and traumatized horses, with Thomas as its director. "There are countless horses like Valor, discarded when they can no longer perform or compete," she explained, her passion evident. "With your gift and my resources, we could give them second chances." Thomas listened, torn between excitement at the proposal and awareness of its implications. "That's a generous offer, but what about my farm?" Eleanor set down her glass. "I had my attorneys look into your situation. The bank is willing to sell the note. You could have your land free and clear, plus a position here with housing and competitive salary." The offer was more than generous, it was life-changing. Yet Thomas hesitated, uncomfortable with what felt like charity. Reading his expression, Eleanor continued, "This isn't a handout, Thomas. It's an investment in something I believe in deeply." Her voice softened. "In someone I believe in." The personal note in her tone shifted the atmosphere between them. For months they had maintained careful boundaries, their growing attachment channeled into their shared commitment to Valor. Now, in this private space, those boundaries seemed increasingly artificial. "And what happens when the novelty of this project wears off?" Thomas asked quietly. "When your board questions the allocation of resources to rescue worthless horses." "Willowbrook is my personal property, not corporate," Eleanor clarified. As for novelty, she stood, walking to her desk to retrieve a leather portfolio, which she handed to Thomas. Inside were architectural drawings, detailed plans for a dedicated rehabilitation facility on the eastern portion of the estate, complete with specialized equipment, housing for staff, and adaptive training areas. "I commissioned these 6 weeks ago," Eleanor said. "This isn't impulse, it's purpose. Something I've lacked for longer than I care to admit." Thomas studied the plans, overwhelmed by their comprehensiveness and what they represented. Eleanor had been envisioning this future well before voicing it. "Why me?" he finally asked, looking up to meet her gaze directly. "There are professional trainers with better credentials." Eleanor sat beside him on the leather sofa, closer than their usual careful distance. "Because credentials don't measure what matters most. Because you see value where others see liability. Because," she paused, gathering courage, "because in helping Valor find his strength again, you've helped me find mine." The admission hung between them, bridging the worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart, his simple farm existence and her empire of wealth. What remained unspoken but increasingly undeniable was how their unlikely connection had grown into something neither had been looking for but both increasingly needed. As autumn deepened around Willowbrook Estates, 3 healing journeys continued in tandem. A horse rediscovering his courage, a woman reclaiming her passion, and a man finding that sometimes the greatest gift is not in possessing something but in helping restore it to its rightful glory. The winter winds swept across Willowbrook with unusual ferocity that December, mirroring the turbulence that had developed in what had become known as the Valor Project. Construction on the rehabilitation facility was well underway, with the main structure already taking shape against the eastern skyline. Thomas had reluctantly accepted Eleanor's offer, his farm now secure though he'd insisted on structured terms that would allow him to repay her investment over time. Their working relationship had evolved into something neither could easily define, deeper than friendship, more complex than professional collaboration, yet carefully maintained within unspoken boundaries. The staff had noticed, of course. Whispers circulated about the wealthy Miss Pierce spending evenings at the modest director's cottage, ostensibly reviewing facility plans but often simply talking until the small hours. Eleanor's board of directors had also taken notice of her divided attention. While Willowbrook was indeed her personal property, her investment firm had begun questioning her recent business decisions, particularly her declining interest in an international expansion they'd been planning for months. The situation came to a head during a snowy evening in mid-December. Thomas was working with Valor in the indoor arena, now focusing on building the horse's confidence with different riders. Under Thomas's guidance, Valor had progressed remarkably, now accepting 3 trusted stable hands on his back for short sessions. Eleanor observed from the viewing area, bundled in a cashmere coat, her face glowing with pride at their shared accomplishment. As they finished for the day, Eleanor's assistant Margaret arrived, her expression tense. The board called an emergency meeting. "Harrison is threatening a vote of no confidence." Eleanor's demeanor instantly transformed, corporate armor sliding back into place. "Tell them I'll be there in 30 minutes. She turned to Thomas. "I'm sorry, we'll have to postpone dinner." He nodded, understanding as always, yet Eleanor didn't miss the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. These evening conversations had become essential to them both, a space where pretenses fell away and honest exchange flourished. The board meeting was every bit as contentious as Margaret had warned. Lawrence Harrison, Eleanor's longest-serving board member, presented financial projections suggesting the firm was losing competitive edge due to leadership distraction. "The Valor Project is consuming resources that could be better directed elsewhere," Harrison argued. "Both financial and personal resources," he added pointedly. Eleanor maintained her composure, though inwardly she seethed at the implication. "My personal investments have never affected my leadership before. This is different," another board member interjected. "You've practically relocated to the stables. The European merger needs your full attention, not some hobby farm for broken-down horses." The dismissive characterization of Thomas' passionate work stung more than any criticism of her leadership. Eleanor ended the meeting with a promise to refocus on corporate priorities, but as she drove back through the snowy night to Willowbrook, conflict raged within her. For the first time in her career, her business ambitions felt hollow compared to the fulfillment she found in the rehabilitation project and in Thomas's company. She arrived at her mansion to find Thomas waiting on the veranda, concern evident in his posture. One look at Eleanor's face told him the meeting had gone poorly. "That bad?" he asked, following her inside. Eleanor poured herself a generous measure of scotch before answering. "They think I've lost my edge. That this project, that you, are a distraction." Thomas absorbed this quietly. the implications settling heavily between them. Are they right? About which part? Eleanor challenged, a rare edge in her voice. Any of it. Thomas moved toward the fireplace, putting distance between them. Eleanor, from the beginning, there's been an imbalance here. You've created something extraordinary for these horses, per me. But at what cost to you? Don't do that, she said sharply. Don't decide what costs I can afford to bear. It's not about money, Thomas countered. It's about what happens when the board forces you to choose between the empire you've built and this. The unfinished sentence hung between them, neither quite ready to name what this had become. Eleanor set down her glass with deliberate care. Perhaps it's time I do choose. For the first time since they'd met, real anger flashed in Thomas's eyes. Don't romanticize this, Eleanor. You've spent 30 years building your company. I won't be the reason you walk away. That's not your decision to make. Isn't it? Thomas challenged. When one option is a world-class business and the other is a farmer and some damaged horses, what kind of choice is that? The rawness of his self-assessment struck Eleanor silent. This was the heart of it. Despite everything they'd shared, Thomas still saw himself as somehow less, still couldn't believe he might be enough. You still don't understand what you've given me, do you? Eleanor finally said, her voice softening. Before you and Valor, I was functioning, not living. My success was just numbers on a page. Thomas shook his head. You can't build a future on gratitude. Is that what you think this is? Eleanor stepped closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. Gratitude? The tension between them had been building for months, unacknowledged feelings growing stronger as they worked side by side, sharing triumphs and setbacks, creating something meaningful together. Now, with their carefully constructed boundaries threatening to collapse, Thomas retreated. I should go, he said quietly. You have decisions to make, and my presence isn't helping you think clearly. Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, the door closing with quiet finality behind him. The following week passed in strained politeness. They focused on the horses, on construction decisions, on anything but the confrontation that had exposed vulnerabilities neither was prepared to address. Eleanor divided her time between Willowbrook and corporate headquarters, throwing herself into the European merger plans with determined efficiency that impressed even Harrison. Thomas, meanwhile, pushed forward with Valor's training, now incorporating other rescued horses that had begun arriving in anticipation of the facility's opening. If the stable hands noticed his subdued mood or Eleanor's increasingly brief visits, they were professional enough not to comment. Then came the night of the benefit gala, a black-tie fundraiser Eleanor had organized to introduce potential donors to the Valor Project. Thomas had agreed months ago to attend, though formal events were far outside his comfort zone. The ballroom of Willowbrook's main house glittered with wealth and influence as Eleanor worked the crowd, every inch the polished executive in a striking emerald gown. Thomas stood awkwardly in his rented tuxedo, answering technical questions about equine rehabilitation when approached but otherwise remaining on the periphery. Midway through the evening, Eleanor took the stage to present the project formally. With professional eloquence, she outlined the facility's purpose and potential impact. Then, departing from her prepared remarks, her voice took on a more personal tone. Many of you have asked why I've invested so heavily in this particular endeavor, she said, her eyes finding Thomas in the crowd. The truth is simple. I lost something precious once, not just the ability to ride, but the courage to try again. This project isn't just about giving horses second chances. It's about recognizing that sometimes our deepest wounds become the source of our greatest purpose, if we're brave enough to face them. As applause filled the room, Thomas slipped outside onto the terrace, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't contain in that glittering crowd. Minutes later, he sensed Eleanor's presence beside him. You shouldn't be out here, he said without turning. Your guests can wait, Eleanor finished. We've left too much unsaid, Thomas. He finally turned to face her, moonlight illuminating the sincerity in her expression. I meant what I said that night. I won't be the reason you compromise everything you built. What if, Eleanor said carefully, what we're building now matters more? The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, an invitation to trust that what they had found together was strong enough to withstand the disapproval of boards and the whispers of society, resilient enough to encompass both their worlds without diminishing either. As stone began to fall softly around them, Thomas Bennett, the farmer who had once had nothing but his integrity, and Eleanor Pierce, the millionaire who had everything except what truly mattered, stood at the threshold of possibility, facing their deepest fears not alone, but together. Just as they had done for Valor, they now had the chance to prove that broken spirits could not only heal but flourish. if given the courage, time, and love to try again. Spring came early to Willowbrook Estates that year, as if nature itself was celebrating new beginnings. The Rehabilitation Center, now officially named Second Chance Stables, stood completed on the eastern fields, its modern facilities housed in structures designed to blend harmoniously with the pastoral landscape. The grand opening was scheduled for the first weekend in May, just 2 weeks away. In the main training ring, Thomas guided Valor through an advanced dressage routine. The transformation in the once terrified animal was nothing short of miraculous. His chestnut coat gleamed with health, muscles rippling beneath as he executed precise movements with newfound confidence. The scar along his flank remained, a permanent reminder of his journey, but it no longer defined him. Eleanor watched from the fence, her heart swelling with pride. The past 3 months had brought profound changes to all their lives. Following the benefit gala, she had restructured her company, appointing a new CEO while transitioning herself to chairwoman, a position that allowed her to maintain strategic oversight, while dedicating more time to the Rehabilitation Center. Lawrence Harrison had resigned in protest, but the board ultimately supported her decision when the European merger succeeded under her modified leadership. More significant than these professional shifts were the personal ones. The careful dance between Thomas and Eleanor had evolved into something neither had dared hope for, a relationship built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a deep understanding that transcended their different backgrounds. "He's ready," Thomas announced as he brought Valor to a halt near where Eleanor stood. "I think he could handle a full demonstration at the opening." Eleanor reached out to stroke Valor's neck, marveling at how the horse now leaned into her touch. "Are you certain? There will be quite a crowd." Thomas nodded confidently. "He's not the same horse anymore. Neither are we the same people." The truth in his words resonated deeply. Eleanor could hardly recognize herself from a year ago, the isolated executive who had built walls around her heart as impenetrable as the security surrounding her estate. Thomas, too, had changed, his natural reserve giving way to a quiet confidence that came from being truly valued for his gifts. Later that afternoon, they walked the grounds of the nearly completed facility, finalizing details for the opening ceremony. 6 rescued horses now occupied the stables, with applications for 20 more under review. The center would employ 15 full-time staff, including veterinarians, trainers, and caregivers, many hired from surrounding rural communities that had struggled economically in recent years. "Did you ever imagine this when you took in that mad horse no one wanted?" Eleanor asked as they paused beside the memorial garden, a peaceful space dedicated to horses, like her beloved Artemis, who hadn't been given the chance at rehabilitation. Thomas shook his head, his weathered face thoughtful. "I was just trying to save one life. You were the one who saw the bigger picture." "We built this together," Eleanor corrected, taking his hand. "Your heart, my resources." The simplicity of this truth had become the foundation of their relationship, each bringing different but equally valuable contributions to create something greater than either could have achieved alone. That evening, they shared dinner on the porch of what had once been called the director's cottage, but had gradually become their shared home. The sprawling mansion still served for formal occasions, but this modest house nearer to the stables had become the heart of their daily lives. Eleanor had discovered an unexpected peace in its simplicity, while Thomas had added personal touches that made the space truly theirs. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they lingered over coffee, "about what happens after the opening." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "We have 20 horses arriving over the next 3 months, training programs starting, research collaborations with 2 universities. Isn't that enough?" Thomas smiled, reaching into his pocket. "I was thinking more personally." He placed a small worn leather box on the table between them, not a typical jeweler's case but something with history etched into its surface. Eleanor's breath caught as she opened it to reveal a simple but elegant ring, a single diamond set in a band that had clearly been lovingly restored. "It was my grandmother's," Thomas explained softly. "My father managed to keep it when we lost everything else. He gave it to me before he died, said to save it for someone who understood that the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as Thomas continued. "I know we come from different worlds. I know people will talk. But this past year has taught me that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships create the strongest bonds." He took her hand gently. "Eleanor Pierce, would you consider building a life with me, not just a business?" Eleanor's answer came without hesitation, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined possible. "Thomas Bennett, I would consider it the greatest privilege of my life." 2 weeks later, the grand opening of Second Chance Stables drew coverage from national media outlets. Attracted by the unusual story of the millionaire investor and the horse whisperer who had created a sanctuary for animals, most had deemed beyond hope. Hundreds of guests, from corporate executives to local farmers, gathered under a perfect blue sky to witness the ribbon cutting. The highlight of the ceremony was the demonstration Eleanor had initially questioned. With Thomas's steadying presence nearby, she mounted Valor before the assembled crowd. Murmurs of appreciation rippled through the audience as they performed a flawless routine, woman and horse moving in perfect harmony, both having overcome fears that once seemed insurmountable. As thunderous applause erupted at their conclusion, Eleanor guided Valor to where Thomas waited. In a spontaneous gesture that would make headlines the following day, she leaned down from the saddle, and they shared a brief kiss, the private becoming public in a declaration that needed no words. Among the crowd stood Dr. Peterson, the veterinarian whose phone call had set the entire journey in motion. Beside him, Howard from the abandoned stables watched with undisguised amazement at Valor's transformation. "If you told me a year ago that this horse would be performing like that, with her on his back, I'd have said you were crazy," Howard admitted, shaking his head in wonder. Dr. Peterson smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the most broken spirits have the greatest capacity for healing. They just need someone who sees past the damage to the potential underneath." That evening, as sunset bathed Willow Brook in golden light, Thomas and Eleanor stood together in Valor's paddock. The horse grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting his head to acknowledge their presence with gentle nickering, a far cry from the terrified animal who once cowered from human contact. "Your father was right," Eleanor said softly, her engagement ring catching the fading light. "The most valuable things can't be measured." Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "I came here with nothing but hope for a broken horse. I found a future I couldn't have imagined." Eleanor smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "We all did, Thomas. Valor taught us that sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to exactly where we're meant to be." As darkness settled over the estate, the unlikely family created by chance and courage, the injured horse who had feared everyone, the poor farmer who had refused to give up on him, and the millionaire whose life had been transformed by them both, stood together under the emerging stars, their separate journeys now irrevocably intertwined in healing, purpose, and love.